Hello everyone. Today we will study about the cerebellum. This part of the brain is known as the cerebellum. This part is known as the cerebellum. Between the two cerebellar hemispheres, these two are the cerebellar hemispheres, and between the two cerebellar hemispheres, we can see a worm-like structure is known as the vermix. This structure you can see. This worm-like structure is known as the vermix of the cerebellum. The vermix is separating the two cerebellar hemispheres from each other. Cerebellum is a part of our hindbrain and it is developed from the rhombencephalon. This part is known as the vermix part of the cerebellum, and these two are the cerebellar hemispheres. Anterior part of the cerebellum, this is the anterior part of the cerebellum. On the anterior part, we can see the pons and the medulla oblongata, and the posterior to pons and the medulla oblongata, this cavity is known as the cavity of the fourth ventricle. In this specimen, you can see in a better way. These are the two cerebellar hemispheres, and in this part, the vermix used to lie. This part, in this specimen, we have cut the vermix to separate the two cerebral hemispheres. And this part, this structure you can see, this is the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is the cavity between the posterior part of the pons and the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. This cavity is the fourth ventricle. So the anterior relations of the cerebellum are fourth ventricle, pons and the medulla oblongata. These three forms the anterior relations of the cerebellum. Now the superior relations of the cerebellum. Superiorly, the tentorium cerebelli forms the relation with the cerebellum. This part is known as the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli is a part or a fold of the dura mater. This tentorium cerebelli, it separates the occipital lobe of the cerebrum from the two cerebellar hemispheres. This part, this you can see, this part, this is the tentorium cerebelli. So tentorium cerebelli is forming the superior part of the cerebellum, superior relation of the cerebellum. Now posteriorly, the posterior relations of the cerebellum is actually the occipital parts of the skull bone. The occipital lobe of the skull bone, it forms the posterior relation of the cerebellum. It comes over here, so it forms the posterior relation of the cerebellum. The function of the cerebellum is to control or form the programming, planning, coordination, equilibrium. These are the functions of the cerebellum to maintain the balance even. Now the parts of the cerebellum. Before telling the parts, I want to tell you one more structure. This part is known as the vallecula. This part of the cerebellum is known as the vallecula. The inferior part where the two cerebellar hemispheres are not attaching with the vermix is known as the vallecula. This part is known as the vallecula of the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum have a lot of folds of grey matter. These are the grey matter of the cerebellum, and these grey matter are formed by the folds of the cerebellar hemispheres. These are the folds of the cerebellar hemispheres, so they are forming the grey matter of the cerebellum. The interior part of the cerebellum, you can see, this is the interior part of the cerebellum. In the interior part of the cerebellum, you can see some leaf-like structures. These are the leaf-like structures, and they are forming the grey matter of the cerebellum. And this structure This structure, you can see, this structure is known as the medullary sclera. This medullary sclera is the white matter of the cerebellum. The fibers which are originating in the and the medullary sclera is formed by the white matter of the cerebellum. This is the white matter where the only nerve fibers are present, and these nerve fibers are entering into the white matter. So they are giving a tree-like structure which is also known as the arbor vitae. Now the parts of the cerebellum. The two cerebral hemispheres and the vermix are divided into some parts. This is the vermix and these are the two cerebral hemispheres. So now we will study about the fissures. There are two fissures in the cerebellum which is dividing the cerebellum into three parts, two big fissures. This fissure is known as the superior fissure or the fissura prima. This fissure is known as the superior fissure or the fissura prima. The superior fissure or the fissura prima, it is dividing the cerebellum into two parts. The superior part, superior or the anterior part, and the inferior or the posteromedial part, this part. Now the second fissure is present. This fissure is known as the inferior fissure. This fissure is known as the inferior fissure. This is the inferior fissure. So these two fissures, superior fissure or the fissura prima, and the inferior fissure, these two are the inferior fissures. Inferior fissure. These two fissures are dividing the cerebellum into three parts. First, the superior part or the anterior part of the cerebellum. We call the superior part as the anterior part of the cerebellum. The middle part is known as the posteromedial part of the cerebellum, and the inferior part of the cerebellum is known as the floccular part of the cerebellum or the floccular nodular part of the cerebellum. These two are the floccular nodular part of the cerebellum. In this specimen, we can get it clear. There are two fissures, two big fissures, these two fissures. Fissure 1, superior fissure, and the inferior fissure. These two fissures are dividing the cerebellum into three parts. First, second, and the third part. These two fissures are dividing the vermix also. The vermix part also. So this is the fissura prima, the superior fissure, and this is the inferior fissure of the cerebellum. So the three parts, the three lobes of the cerebellum has been formed. This part is known as the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, and the second part is known as the posteromedial lobe of the cerebellum, and the inferior part is known as the floccular nodular lobe of the cerebellum. This part is known as the floccular nodular lobe of the cerebellum. And there are some more fissures which are dividing the cerebellar hemispheres into 8 parts, and the vermix, which is not present in this specimen, the vermix into 9 parts. We can appreciate these parts in of the cerebellum. Now there are some more fissures also present in the cerebellum which are dividing the cerebellar hemisphere as well as the vermix into some parts. They are dividing the cerebellar hemisphere into 8 parts and the vermix into 9 parts. In this specimen, we can appreciate it better. Small fissures present in the cerebellum. These are dividing the vermix and the cerebellar hemispheres into some parts. They are dividing the vermix into 9 parts. The superior part of the vermix is known as the lingula. The second part of the vermix, this is the superior part of the vermix. This is known as the lingula. And the second part of the vermix is known as, this is the second part of the vermix. This is known as the central lobule. The third part of the vermix is known as the culmen. This part is the culmen part of the vermix. This is the third part. The fourth part of the vermix is known as the declive. This part, declive part. The fifth part of the vermix is known as the folium part. This part is the folium part of the vermix. Then sixth part is known as the tuber part of the vermix. Tuber part. Then seventh is the pyramidal part. Eighth is the uvula part, and ninth is the nodular part. So lingula comes in the superior part of the vermix, and this part, lingula, is the nodular part is the inferior part of the vermix. This is the nodular part of the vermix. And in the cerebral hemispheres, these fissures are dividing, these small fissures are dividing the cerebral hemispheres into 8 parts. First is the ala of the cerebellum. The superior part of the cerebellum is known as the ala of the cerebellum. Then second part is known as the quadrangular lobule of the cerebellum. Then below the quadrangular lobule, it comes the simple lobule of the cerebellum. Then below the simple lobule, it comes the superior semilunar lobule. Below to superior semilunar lobule, it comes the inferior semilunar lobule, and inferior semilunar lobule, below to it we can see the biventral lobule of the cerebellum. This is the biventral lobule of the cerebellum, and below to it we can see the tonsil of the cerebellum, and below to the tonsil we can see the floccular part of the cerebellum. This part is the floccular part of the cerebellum. And why the vermix is having 9 parts and the cerebellar hemispheres are having 8 parts? Because the superior part of the the superior part of the vermix, which is known as the lingula, it is present superiorly and separately. So no fissure is running on this lingula part. That is why the vermix is having 9 parts, and the cerebral hemispheres are having 8 parts. This part, the vermix controls the muscles of head, neck, shoulders and the trunk, the vermix. Beside the vermix, intermediate zone comes. This, if we draw a longitudinal imaginary line, this will be the intermediate zone. The intermediate zone of the cerebellum, it controls the muscles of our limbs, the 2 upper limbs and the 2 lower limbs. The muscles of these 4 limbs are controlled by the intermediate zone, and the remaining part of the cerebellum is known as the lateral zone of the cerebellum. The lateral zone controls or regulate functions like programming, planning and coordination, and the floccular nodular lobe functions like equilibrium. So thank you so much. It is all about the cerebellum.